Okay, hi again, everybody. I'm calling this lecture Coase and Criticism. It's some critiques of the Coase theorem, uh, and we'll see what that entails and what I mean by that. Okay, hi again, everyone. I'm calling this lecture Coase and Criticism, for lack of a better title. We're just going to look at some critiques of the so-called Coase theorem. We'll see what that entails. Okay, I want to say something about why there's often a lot of literature and debate about the Coase theorem. The view before Coase was that this source of a negative externality ought to be taxed or held liable for damages, otherwise the result would be inefficient. Coase's view was that the market would lead to an efficient solution so long as the parties could bargain over the externality, provided there were no transaction costs, which Coase regarded as not actually ever being the case. That was actually Coase's real point, but people have taken the Coase theorem to mean, well, what would the market look like in the absence of transaction costs? Okay, so the debate over the validity of the Coase theorem then often becomes part of a political debate regarding the role of the state in the markets. I mean, if you might remember when we were talking about the conservative and progressive schools, I say as framed by, excuse me, I meant as framed by. The conservative and progressive schools, for those two schools of thought, by and large, the debate was one over liberty. Here the debate winds up being framed in terms of efficiency, but the reason it becomes important, I think, for lots of people is that it has implications for our notions of liberty. Right, because the implication of the Coase theorem seemed to be that there was less room for the state and the law, or I should say, I suppose, less of a role for the state and the law than we previously had supposed. Okay. Now, you can divide up the Coase theorem into two parts. We didn't do this previously. But you can, and it often is divided this way, into one, an efficiency thesis, saying that with clearly specified property rights, parties will bargain to an efficient outcome in the absence of transaction costs, and an invariance thesis, that with clearly specified property rights, the parties will bargain to the same outcome in the absence of transaction costs. Okay, but the first doesn't necessarily imply the second if there is more than one efficient result. And we did actually already learn in a previous lecture that the efficient result depends on the initial distribution. We're just going to unpack that a little bit further and apply it to Coase. And the reason we know that is because the willingness to pay depends on your wealth in part, and your wealth actually will depend on the initial distribution of rights. Having a right makes you more wealthy. Okay, so again, imagine your neighbor plays loud music, and you try to stop him, but the court sides with him, and he comes to you and demands $500 to stop. Would you be willing to pay? Well, that might depend, at least in part, on your wealth. Your constrained wealth might only permit you to offer him $100 to stop. Was the outcome efficient? Yes, right, in the sense that the benefits of quiet are less than the costs of the noise, measured by each party's subjective valuation. You can only afford $100 for him to stop, and he demands $500 to stop. Okay, so it would be more costly to him than it would benefit you, measured this way. And we've done that. Okay, so now imagine that you have the legal right to quiet, and your neighbor now wants to pay you to purchase that right back, to play his music. The noisy neighbor is now the poorer one for not having the property right. So imagine, for example, you demand $500 to give up that right to quiet, but the neighbor, because he's wealth constrained, only offers $100. Here again, the outcome's efficient in the sense that the benefits of quiet are greater than the cost of the noise, measured by each neighbor's subjective valuation. Okay, so now I want to describe this in terms of Pareto-Efficiency again. Notice that in both cases the outcome is Pareto-efficient. In both cases, one party can't be made better off without the other being made worse off. Otherwise, there would be a trade in the absence of transaction costs. Remember, that's the interpretation of trade. If it doesn't happen, it's because one party would be made worse off. Okay, so but in these examples, we had more than one result, each of which was Pareto efficient. So Coasean bargaining, even if it always, assuming that other parts of the argument are correct, even if it always reaches a Pareto efficient outcome, does not necessarily reach the same Pareto-efficient outcome. We can illustrate these principles with an Edgeworth box like we've done before, but we're just applying it to Coase's logic is all we're doing. All right, so we can put Alice here, and I could put Bill here, and I could say that Alice wants more quiet. Oops, I wanted to make that red to make it consistent. Alice wants more quiet if she goes in this direction. Sorry. She wants more quiet, the Q for quiet, and she can have up to 24 hours. And Bill wants more noise, and he can have up to 24 hours of noise. Right, I mean, we're trading off noise for quiet. And I could put money on the horizontal for both of them. Right, and as we go this way, Alice pays more to Bill. And as we go this way, Bill pays more to Alice. We can imagine a beginning where Bill has most of the right to quiet. That could be somewhere around here. In which case, Alice might have an indifference curve that passes through it like this, and Bill might like this, in which case they would bargain to some point in the I-shaped region there. Or they could start with the court awarding Alice most of the property right to quiet, somewhere around here, in which case Alice might have an indifference curve that looked perhaps like this, and Bill might have one that looks perhaps like this, and again they would bargain to that interior region. Right? So the ultimate Pareto-efficient point to which they bargain depends on where they start. And when we did that analysis before, we're just applying it again to the idea of an externality. There's going to be more than one Pareto-efficient allocation of quiet and noise and wealth for each one of them. And again, to use the extreme examples, if Alice was entirely wealth constrained over here, if she was entirely wealth constrained and had no right to quiet at all, and Bill had the right to 24 hours of noise, and Alice had nothing to give Bill because she was constrained by her wealth, if she couldn't bribe Bill at all to be quiet, that would be Pareto efficient. This point right here, this point right here is Pareto efficient. As is, that's in the southeast. As is this point in, this point in the northeast, entirely Pareto efficient. If Alice had the right of 24 hours of quiet, and Bill had nothing to bribe Alice with, that too, do that again, this too would be Pareto efficient. Okay, those are principles we discussed before, but we can see that although Coase may be right in saying that parties will bargain to a Pareto efficient result, there's more than one Pareto efficient result. So the efficiency thesis does not necessarily imply the invariance thesis. Okay. And here I'm just repeating that again. Here, as we know, there's more than one Pareto efficient point. Right? The fact that Coasean bargaining might lead to an efficient allocation, regardless of the initial assignment or property right, does not mean it will lead to the same allocation. Okay, so that in turn may mean that the initial assignment of the property right would matter if one party is sufficiently wealth constrained. Okay, and a related reason that the initial assignment of the right may matter, it's related but it's not the same, is that people experience a diminishing marginal utility of income. Now this means that the next dollar you have is less valuable to you than the previous dollar. Okay, so for example, imagine you're broke. How valuable to you is $20? It might be really valuable. You're desperate for $20. But now imagine you're Bill Gates. So how much is $20 to Bill Gates? Not very much. What does it mean to Bill Gates? What is $20 to Bill Gates, right? All right, so hopefully that illustrates the idea of diminishing marginal utility of income. The more income you have, the less the next dollar matters to you. Okay, so why is that relevant for our purposes here? Well, it's relevant for the question of whether the initial assignment of property rights matters. If people experience diminishing marginal utility of income, then the amount they will pay for an entitlement that they don't have will be less than the amount they accept for an entitlement they do have. Right? So imagine that quiet time for you provides, I've got you here twice, sorry, 100 units of utility. Right? And imagine your neighbor has the right to be noisy. If your first $1,000 brings you 100 units of utility, assuming we can measure utility that way, then you'd be willing to pay up to $1,000. But if you own the right to be quiet, you would demand more than $1,000 to give it up, because the $1,000 you would demand gives you less utility than the $1,000 you already have. Diminishing marginal utility of income. The next 1,000 is less value than the previous 1,000. You value it less. So to get 100 units of utility, you'd have to demand something greater than $1,000. Okay, so therefore, if you own the right, you're going to demand more to give it up than if you didn't own it, just based alone on this phenomenon of diminishing marginal utility of income. So that's another way that the initial assignment of the right matters. Now, the initial assignment of the right may matter in other ways. And very generally, these are sometimes called endowment effects, and there are lots of different explanations for them. But apart from wealth effects, and apart from the diminishing marginal utility of income, it seems that people may value what they already have. Right? And that could be because people have an aversion to loss. And one example from the Kelman paper you have on the Coase theorem and ideology is, and he borrowed this from somebody else, but imagine some college professor never pays more than $35 for a bottle of wine. He will never buy a $100 bottle of wine. It's not worth it to him. From his buying behavior, it seems that a $100 bottle of wine is not worth it to him. He buys a $5 bottle of wine. It turns out over time to be worth $100. And so a wine dealer comes along and offers $100, but the college professor drinks it. So is it worth it to him or not to pay $100 for wine? Well, he gave up $100. He could have had it. What is the subjective valuation of wine? Is it up to $35? Is it greater than $95? It was not worth $95 for him to obtain wine. But he was willing to give up $95 for him to avoid losing wine. That's the $100 that was offered him, minus the $5 he paid for it up front. He's not willing to spend money to get it, but he spends money in the sense that he turns down an offer to have it, to keep it. Moving from having it to not having it is more important. And try that again. It costs him more. He doesn't want to lose what he has. Why is this? It could be an aversion to loss. There's a lot of experimental data on this. I like this example that's also in Kelman's piece, just because, I don't know, it's about baseball, and maybe some people want to strike some people's interests. Right, it used to have a reserve clause system, maybe you guys know that. Right, so players were bound to play for the team that bought them, or the team to whom they were sold, or they could retire. And so would the shift to a free agency system mean that players would wind up with different teams? Well, not according to the Coase theorem. All right, so imagine Team A valued a player at $60,000, but Team B valued him at $100,000. So we'd imagine that Team A would sell him to Team B. Right, it's not worth it to Team A, but it's worth it to Team B, so there should be a deal. And he'd wind up with Team B. If the reserve clause system were ended, which eventually was, then the player himself would go from Team A to Team B. He'd be richer, right, and he'd have the property right. But the end result would be the same. The final allocation would be the same. Right? And we would expect that any team that decides to keep a player under the reserve clause system must be valuing him more. So under a free agent system, you just expect him to sign the player. And the final allocation would be the same. Okay, this is not what happened. Teams that did not sell players until under the reserve clause system also didn't keep them as free agents. It turned out there were more than 20 free agents in the 2 years after the end of the reserve clause system, and not one stayed with the original team. So most teams' willingness to accept was higher than their willingness to pay. Right? If they didn't have them, they weren't willing to pay to get them. But if they did have them, they demanded more if they wanted to let go. So the final allocation does depend in this sense as well on the initial assignment of the right. I want to relate this back to people's indifference curves to make the point that this seems to not necessarily be about wealth or diminishing marginal utility of income. So, okay, two commodities. People are given pens. I'm going to put P for pens. Sometimes P is price on that axis, but P is for pens here. And money is on this axis. Okay, so what's their trade-off of pens for money? Well, it turns out it depends on whether they have pens first or money first. If they have pens first, their indifference curve looks something like this. So to give up, say, maybe this represents 1 pen, this is a longer distance this way. They might demand $5. But if they start with money, the indifference curve might look something like this. So that to give up, say just maybe this distance here represents just $1. To give up $1, they might demand a whole lot of pens. So their indifference curves look different depending on whether they start with pens or money. Right? So it's not a question of what utility curve they reach in the Edgeworth box. It's a question of the shape of the utility curves themselves. They change depending on what you have first. Okay. Okay, so now as I mentioned, the explanation that we posited before, and that's out there in the literature, concerns loss inversion. Once people have something, they don't want to lose it. There could be a related explanation, which is, what if people refuse to sell something not because they're averse to loss, but because they believe they're entitled to it? Now this is an interesting explanation, because if that's the case, then the initial assignment of the right would affect the final allocation, because the preferences themselves would depend on the legal system of rights. All right, again, this is Kelman's example. Perhaps a neighbor to a polluting factory refuses to sell his right to clean water just because he doesn't believe it's something to be sold. Right? The legal regime of rights maybe sends a message as to what's just and what's unjust, and that reinforces our preferences in some way. The experimental evidence on this stuff seems to bear this out, and I haven't asked you to look at it, except a little bit, but not in great length. But the differences between willingness to pay and willingness to accept is much higher when the goods are non-market goods, such as environmental quality or health risks. We'll see this a little more in the next lecture, but if people are asked to give up, or to increase their risk to their health, if they believe they've already got it and already have the right to it, they don't want to give it up. They demand a whole lot to give it up. We'll see that more in the next lecture. Right? They don't view it as a market good. Okay, so I just wanted to quote from Kelman's piece, because it just makes the point so strongly. He says, consider the case of rape. In the Coase theorem world, the amount of rape is unaffected by whether the victim must bribe the attacker to refrain from raping her, or whether the attacker must compensate the victim for the rape. For this proposition to be true, one would have to assume that the rule against rape had no effect on either the attacker's taste for forced intercourse or on the woman's view of the outrageousness of forced sexual conduct. All right, obviously it's a provocative example. Right? The point is, if you believe you have the right to something, you're not going to sell it. And if the law starts saying, well, no, this is something that can be bargained over, then people might start bargaining over it and seeing it as a commodity to be sold. So the law might reinforce a certain view on whether a commodity can be sold or not. Now, this could potentially work the other way as well. People's propensity to buy and sell things could increase if the law permits them to be sold. So Kelman's example is, imagine a black market for babies. Should it be legalized? There is a black market for babies, more so in different countries. Right? So would legalization of the market just give expression to people's preferences alone? Or would it send a message that it's permissible to view babies as commodities, and then as a result of that, people might desire to view them as commodities and trade them? Right? If the latter is true, then allowing people to trade doesn't merely give effect to their preferences, it alters the preferences themselves. Right? So just the change in the legal regime itself would change which allocations are Pareto efficient. Suddenly I might be willing to sell something where before I wasn't. Okay, so what we just did is we looked at various ways in which the initial assignment of legal rights would have an effect on the final allocation. Even if we're confining our perspective to that of efficiency, right? They may all create an efficient. The Coase bargaining may lead to an efficient result, but there could be more than one efficient result, and for a variety of reasons. One is wealth constraints. People might not be able to afford what the other one is demanding. Another is the diminishing marginal utility of income. As you're richer, your income matters less to you, so you're going to demand more to give something up. One is a psychological phenomenon of loss aversion. You don't want to give up what you have. And then there's what Kelman calls the socio-legal impact, for lack of a better term for it. But the idea is that the legal regime itself sends a message as to what you have the right to, and that's going to affect whether you're willing to bargain over it or not. Or if you are, how much your demand for something that you believe is not really for sale. Okay? So all of these are ways in which the scope or the power of the Coase theorem might be seen to be diminished. Because even if technically Coase bargaining leads to an efficient result, there could be a number of different efficient results given the way efficiency is defined. And therefore the Coase theorem might not be saying as much as it purports to be saying. Okay, and I'll see you guys next time.